Hello, dear viewer and learner. Welcome to your favorite program, The Knowledge Quest. I'm your teacher, Alex Obara, and I'll be taking you through history and government. And we are still discussing, we are on with our topic, the contacts between East Africa and the outside world. Just a quick recap of what we have initially discussed. We discussed about the early visitors to the East African coast before 1500 AD. We gave examples of those visitors, why they came to the East African coast. And then we went further and discussed about the Arabs, right? And we discussed on the Indian Ocean trade and how the trade was established. And then thereafter we discussed on the coming of the Portuguese. And we saw how the Portuguese established their rule, how they ruled the East African coast for 200 years. And then thereafter the Portuguese were driven out by the coming of the Omani Arabs in the year 1698, when the Omani Arabs captured Fort Jesus. Then thereafter there was establishment of the Omani rule. However, we said before the establishment of the Omani rule, there were power struggles between two families. That is the Busaidi family, that is from Oman, and the Al Mazrui family in the coast. But eventually we realized that the Omani Arabs were able to capture and establish their rule in East African coast. Then after that was done, Sayyid Said, who was the Oman or the Imam then, transferred his capital from Muscat in Oman and brought it to Zanzibar. And we looked at some of the reasons. Just to mention a few, we said Zanzibar was centrally placed. He had the desire to control the trade. We say that also there was a desire for him to control the trade in East African coast. We said Zanzibar was an island, therefore it was strategically located for him to easily see the enemies from far and therefore defend and safeguard his territory. And also we said that Said also considered the fact that Zanzibar had fertile soils and clean water, which was important in as far as agriculture is concerned. Then eventually we saw that Said established plantation agriculture, and we defined what plantation agriculture is. We say the growing of one type of crop on a large piece of land is what we refer to as plantation farming. And we saw that eventually, due to establishment of plantation farming, there was re-emergence of slave trade. Slave trade again re-emerged, and we saw some of the reasons why slave trade re-emerged. And then we discussed what I want us to go through very quickly as we proceed, methods which were used to obtain slaves. We said there were slave trades which were usually intra and inter-community. Intra, we said within the community, and inter, between different communities. And then we talked about the chiefs sold the criminals to traders. Then we talked about kidnapping of children and lone travelers to slave trade. And then of course, number 4, we said there were those who were defenseless and helpless people were also captured and taken as captives. So those are some of the methods which were employed in capturing slaves. And then eventually you realize that slave trade was abolished. It means that slave trade did not last for so long. So due to some reasons, slave trade was abolished. So therefore we want to look at the factors that led to the abolition of slave trade. Factors that led to the abolition. To abolish is to do away with, all right? So factors that led to the doing away with of slave trade. So the first one is the role of humanitarians, all right? The role of humanitarians, and the leading humanitarians, or people who had humanity, people who thought like all human beings have equal rights. They advocated for equality of human beings. So those are referred to as humanitarians. So the role of humanitarians, mainly from Britain, including Granville Sharp, William Wilberforce, they considered slave trade as inhumane, all right, and a violation of human rights. And therefore, they advocated for the end of slave trade. So it's important for you to understand the examples of humanitarians who are involved in advocating against slave trade. So we said we have Granville Sharp and William Wilberforce. These were humanitarians, and mostly they were from Britain. And therefore, they advocated against slave trade by asserting that human beings were equal. So it was inhumane to carry out slave trade, and it was a violation of human rights. And then number two, there is the aspect of industrial revolution. I want you to understand, with the Industrial Revolution, there was introduction of machines. There was introduction of using machines in industries and in the farms. That means human labor was rendered useless, quote unquote. It was rendered not very useful. Therefore, with the introduction of Industrial Revolution, more machines were used in the farm, and therefore it meant that human beings or slaves were rendered not very important, and therefore that led to the abolition of slave trade. Number three, people were needed back on their farms in Africa to produce. Of course, you realize with Industrial Revolution there was also what referred to as Agrarian Revolution. All right, so that means that those people who were undertaking Agrarian Revolution required raw materials for their industries. That means there was need, all right? As you say, people were needed back on their farms in Africa to produce cheap raw materials for British industries, all right? So it meant that slave trade, again, it meant that as they were carrying out slave trade, they'll capture more, and that meant back in Africa, there was little labor to work in the farms. And therefore, it means that abolishing slave trade, there are more people who remain in Africa to work in those farms and produce cheap raw materials. These people also will also constitute a market for British processed goods. Okay, that's another reason that those people who were captured as slaves, they also contribute or constitute the market. In other words, people who would participate in buying those processed goods. Therefore, it meant if they were captured, a lot of them, and take them to Europe, it meant there was no market for processed goods. Therefore, to balance the question, they thought it's important to, abolish slave trade so as to have a market back in Africa for the processed British goods. All right, and also we said machines were being installed in industries. All right, they replaced manual labor. Sorry, there is a typo here. Labor, that should be labor, as they were more efficient and reliable than slaves. Of course, you realize that machines were more efficient, reliable. Human beings could become tired easily, but machines could work for number of hours and number of days without necessarily having stop. And sometimes you realize human beings could be injured in the industry. They could lose their lives. That's inefficiency. But you realize machines were installed, and those machines were faster, efficient, and reliable than the slaves. And then there are also influence of writings by people who wrote journals. For example, Dr. Livingstone, who campaigned against slave trade and its evils. So these are writings or journals which were written by some leading philanthropists or people who are, advocating against slave trade. And we say the example is Dr. Livingstone, David Livingstone, who wrote a journal campaigning against slave trade and its evils. Therefore, he pointed out outrightly the evils of slave trade. The number 7, there is the influence of British economists such as Adam Smith. Adam Smith had an argument, being an economist. He argued and said that free people were more productive than slaves. Therefore, he meant if those people wanted more productivity in their farms, if they wanted more productivity in the industries, it's to let people be free, because free people are more productive, right? You realize that when human beings are forced to do things, they rebel. And by rebelling, productivity goes down. But if you allow human beings to be free, they'll voluntarily work, and therefore means production goes high. That is the high from which Adam Smith, an economist, argued, and that of course influenced the abolition of slave trade. So what were some of the steps? We look at some of the treaties actually which were signed, which eventually led to the abolishment of slave trade. So steps in the abolition of slave trade, okay? Steps in the abolition of slave trade. Very important, because sometimes you can be questioned. You identify some of the treaties which were signed to signal the end of slave trade. So in the year 1822, we had the first treaty called the Mosby Treaty. Okay, the Mosby Treaty. Mosby, it forbade the sale of slaves to areas like West Indies, Reunion, and Mauritius, as well as Arabia. Okay, so it was called the Mosby Treaty. It was reinforced by the British Naval Patrol. So the British Navy, who were patrolling on the sea, enforced that law by ensuring that there were no slaves on board or in ships being transported to West Indies, Reunion, Mauritius, and Arabia. Okay? So the second treaty, which was signed in the year 1845, was the Hamilton Treaty, which actually was signed and forbade trade between Zanzibar and Oman. Okay? So we have the first one, the Mosby Treaty. The second one is the Hamilton Treaty. Then the third one is called the Freer. It's called the Freer Treaty. I don't know, some call it Frere, but it's Freer Treaty. It was signed by the British and Said Bargash. Okay, so it forbade slave in any part of Sultan's dominion, and therefore it meant that all slave markets were closed. And in the year 1907, slavery was finally abolished in the East African territory. So basically, in a nutshell, those are the steps which were taken to ensure there was abolishment of slave trade in East Africa as a whole. So the first one, we say the Mosby Treaty. The second one is the Hamilton Treaty. The third one, we call it the Freer Treaty. And therefore, in 1907, slave trade was done away with. Therefore, it was an offense for anybody or anyone to involve themselves in slave trade after 1907, because that is when slave trade was outlawed. Let us look at some of the negative effects of slave trade on the people, more so on the Africans, the negative effects of slave trade. The first one, Africans suffered widespread suffering. They suffered widespread suffering and misery during the slave raids. In Form 2, I will be discussing with you about the transatlantic trade, also called the triangular trade, or the transatlantic slave trade. It will give you a clear image on what Africans went through during this exercise. So the first negative impact is Africans suffered widespread misery during the raids. How the Africans were captured, how the raiding was done, how brutal it was excruciating. It was a different experience, a bad one. And therefore, that was the first negative experience. Number two, there was the aspect of losing lives, loss of life. That meant that those Africans who resisted, those Africans who fought, those Africans who tried to fight for their freedom, at some point were killed, right? Or even the process of raiding some communities through ambushes at night, through surprise attacks at night. It meant that people could resist, and in the process of resisting, we'll have casualties. Therefore, there was loss of life, which also was a negative impact in that. Number three, there was destruction of property. Okay? And of course, like we are saying, raiding is not an easy experience or a good experience. There must be, damage in that case. So destruction of property, like houses, like crops, which led to famine, destitution, and and poverty. So people, because their properties were destroyed, their crops burnt down, their houses brought down, there was famine. destitution, and there was poverty among the African people, and that is really negative. And then number 4, there was the aspect of disintegration of family ties, the breakup of family ties. That implies that because families that were initially together, families which were initially united, but because their people were, taken, displaced, stolen during those raids, those families broke down, disintegrated. So there was disintegration of family ties due to displacement during raids. Then there was also another aspect of depopulation. This means that in the hinterland, those people were mostly able-bodied. I want you to realize that when the slave leaders were coming to raid, they would not just take anybody. They were mostly interested in able-bodied people. Why do you think they were interested in the able-bodied people? The reason is these able-bodied people could provide labor, right? They were not interested in the weaklings. They were interested in men or women or young men who were able-bodied, so that this could be able to provide labor. But in the process, you realize those young men and women, as they were being taken, there was reduction in population. There was the aspect of depopulation in the hinterland. And that, of course, is very negative, detriment to the economy, to the well-being, and to the survival of people. And then another negative effect of slave trade, it led to fear, suspicion. Yeah, so people could not live in peace. Every time you're living in fear, and if there is a stranger in land, then you're suspicious this could be an enemy or somebody who is coming with motives of attacking and raiding for slaves. So people lost confidence in their leaders. Why? Sometimes the leaders could be involved in the slave business, right? So therefore it meant that people lost confidence in their leaders. There was a lot of suspicion, and therefore that also, as we note, was to the detriment of the people of Africa in that case. Number 7, the use of guns led to increased warfare. The use of guns led to increased warfare. There was introduction of guns, of course, and that means that people could participate more actively in war. Yeah, as opposed to initially where we said they had crude weapons like spears and arrows. But in this case, there is introduction of guns. So the use of guns led to increased warfare between people of different, disagreements, between different communities, between families and families. So there was increased warfare as a result of introduction of guns. Number 8, we say slave trade undermined traditional industries. All right? And you realize this was true in the sense that crafts and those things which were made locally were replaced by imported goods. Okay? They were replaced by imported goods. So maybe they could say we are taking slaves and introduce and give you this kind of goods. So slaves were a commodity. Like we saw earlier initially, slaves were a good. So human beings were treated as goods. So this, in essence, undermined local or traditional, we call them traditional industries, and crafts due to their replacement by imported goods. Then there was also the aspect of laws of skilled labor. And of course, you realize that negatively affected the economy, because those people who were supposed to be involved in building the economy as far as labor is concerned, as far as making crafts and all that, were taken as slaves, and therefore left those people who were unskilled, right? And therefore that, of course, again, was the detriment of the economy of the people of East Africa. Eastern Coast Africa. And then number 10, it opened up the interior of Africa for European penetration and eventual colonization. All right? Slave trade was also negative because it opened up the interior. And opening up the interior of Africa, the Europeans realized, in Africa there could be more resources. In Africa, there could be more of that than just meets the eye. So therefore, they were interested. And eventually, they came to the East Africa and they were able to establish colonialism. So that is also another negative impact or result that came as a result of a slave trade. Let us look at the positive results as we wind up. I'll give you the first three. We go for a break, and then when we come back, I'll be able to proceed. So the first one is establishment of flourishing plantations. There was establishment of flourishing plantation to mean that the labor which was provided for by slaves was important in the plantations, all right? And therefore, it meant that plantation grew and people were getting more products. And then there was the introduction of new crops, food crops, which we saw example of cassava, example of cashew nuts, we talked about maize. All these were introduced as a result of slave trade. And the third one we said is the spread and use of Kiswahili in many parts of East and Central Africa. As a result of slave trade, there was introduction of Kiswahili as lingua franca, as a language which was used largely in East and Central Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go for a short break. When we come back, we shall be able to explore the positive impacts of slave trade and then still move further. So see you shortly after the break. Welcome back after the short break, and now let us proceed with our discussions. And we were finalizing on the impacts of slave trade on the people of East Africa. We have explored the negative results or the impacts, and now we want to just finalize on the positive. And we said the first one was the establishment of flourishing plantations. I explained that. We said there was introduction of new food crops. We gave examples. And we said Kiswahili spread in many parts of East and Central Africa. It became a lingua franca in many places. We said it was used. If you go to areas in East Africa, talk about Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, talk about in areas of Central Africa, Kiswahili spread out as a result of slave trade. And then number 4, there was spread of Islam and Islamic culture. As a result of slave trade, you realize that there's some people who went along with their culture. So they were able to get that culture and, of course, at the same time spread their culture. So we say there was spread of Islam and Islamic culture. And then we say number 5, there was development of cloth and other related industries. We say these are crops which were grown mostly in areas like Zanzibar. They were done by Sayyid Said. So as a result of this, you realize that there was development of such industries related with cloth production and other crops also. And then lastly, but not least as a positive, there was establishment of homes for freed slaves at Bagamoyo and Freetown. So you realize that homes were established due to the slave trade. At some point positively we look at it that homes were established, but these homes were for those freed who had been slaves who had been freed from slaves, and we say those was mainly in Bagamoyo and in Freetown. All right. So having looked at slave trade, we want to look at the next type of trade, of course, which again took place in the East African territory, and this is the long distance trade. So we will be able to explore deeply and see how the long distance trade developed, what it involves, what was it about, what were the commodities involved, and all that. So let us look at that and look into details of the long distance trade. So development, organization, and consequences of long distance trade. So as you can see from the term long, it means actually trade which took place over these long distances, just walking or traveling over long distances, but it is a local form of trade. And as we reach in, as we shall be able to move into Form 2 in our next discussions, we shall be looking at different types of trade. I'll differentiate for you what is local trade, international trade, regional trade. But now in this case, we are basically focusing on long distance trade. So the first point I want you to know that long distance trade, it took place between east coast of Africa and the interior in the 19th century. That's why we call it local, because it was within the local areas. So the point here I want you to notice this, that this long distance trade took between east coast of Africa. Can you picture that in your mind? East coast of Africa and the interior. Interior, this means the continental area, like areas far away from the coastline, all right, in the 19th century. So that's why it's basically referred to as long distance. And then number two, this trade involved exchange of trade items between communities over long distances. So you realize that's why we call it long distance. It involved exchange of trade commodities. That tells you by default the method of trade here was barter trade, because we're talking of exchange of trade items, all right? Not exchange of trade items for currency, but exchange of trade items between communities over long distances. That should evoke in your mind that the method used here is barter trade. Further still, we look at the reasons for the development of the long distance trade. Why did it develop? Okay, why did the long distance trade develop? And we say this trade is basically between East African coast and the hinterland, or the interior of East African coast, far away from the coastline. So the first one is the demand for ivory in Europe and the Americas. The demand for ivory in Europe and the Americas. That is meant to mean that most of the ivory were found in the interior. Okay, so the people of the coast looked for ivory in the interior from the locals in the interior, so that those ivory could be transported to the coast and thereafter exported to Europe and Americas where they were needed. All right, so that's the first reason for the development of the long distance trade between East African coast and the hinterland or the interior. Number two, there was demand, okay? There was demand for slaves due to plantation agriculture along the coast. So again, another reason why long distance trade is developing is for the need of, number two, slaves. Number one, we said, is ivory. Number two is slaves. And these slaves were important because you realize that along the coast we had development of plantation farming, and they were needed to provide labor, all right? So there was that aspect of the demand for slaves. And number three, there was sugar plantations in Reunion and Mauritius. If you can remember, we call these one of the French sugar plantations, which were in the Reunion and Mauritius, the islands Reunion and Mauritius. So in that case also, slaves were needed as a commodity for those plantations. So these three reasons actually necessitated the development of trade between the coastal people, or the East African coast, and the interior, called long distance trade. Some of the methods which were used for the long distance trade include the following. The first method which was used was barter system of trade. And talking about barter system of trade, in this case we are referring to exchange of goods for goods. Okay, so it is exchange, maybe it's human beings for something else, but not currency. But later, after the introduction of currency, we have the form of currency being used. Okay, so the first one was barter, exchange of goods for goods, and then later we had form of currency, which in this case we said initially was cowrie shells, and then eventually coins were introduced. Okay, so those are the methods which were used. So I want you to categorically look at the kind of goods which were imported to the interior. That means goods which were got from the coast, okay, the East African coast, to the interior, and then exports from the interior. So meaning goods from the interior to the East African coast and then eventually outside. So let us begin to see goods to the interior. These are goods from outside to the interior, okay? So we have beads, utensils, iron hose, all right? We have cowrie shells, cotton cloth, okay? We have copper wire, red dyes, and then brass wire. So these ones were not locally available in the interior. They were got and imported to the interior. Hope you're following that. So these are goods imported to the interior. Then there's those goods exported, meaning these are available in the interior and they are exported, taken outside of the interior of Africa to the East African coast and eventually out. So number one, slaves, all right? It is sad because these are human beings here being exchanged for these ones here, okay? So maybe they could take slaves for cotton cloth or slaves for cowrie shells. Then we have iron as another commodity or as another export. Then we have animal skins, right? Then we have iron ornaments. We have gum, rhinoceros horns, red copal, beeswax, and honey. So these goods, ladies and gentlemen, were locally available and they were exported in exchange of these ones here. All right? So these are goods produced from the local to the interior, then from the interior to exportation. All right? So these were imported, these were exported from the interior. Having looked at that, we shall proceed and look at the trade routes. Because it's a long distance trade, we look at the trade, which were the routes which were used during the trade. So I will just give you examples of those trade routes, and if you probably could go to your atlases, you'll be able to look at those towns. So we'll just mention the towns in which they went through. So we have from Mombasa through the Mijikenda area. Mijikenda, we say these are the 9 tribes of the coast, the Band, the Giriama, the Chonyi, and all those. So via the Mijikenda area to Taita Taveta, and then from Taveta, they branched into two. The first route went to Kilimanjaro, and then to Lake Victoria region, okay? And then we have the second route, which proceeded to northward, okay? Northward from Taita Taveta across the Galana River into Cumberland, then to Mount Kenya region and the western parts of Kenya. So if you go keenly look at the map of Kenya, you'll be able to note those routes from Mombasa to Mijikenda area, Taita Taveta. Then there's that route, and then there's one which goes to the western part. The second trade route is from Kilwa. Okay, those are old towns in the coast, from Kilwa to Yao, where from there it branched southwards to Sewa in Zimbabwe. All right, so that's the second trade route. The third one began from Bagamoyo to Tabora, where from there it branched northwards to Buganda, with the western branch proceeding to Ujiji and then to Zaire. So those are examples of trade routes which were actually used in this trade. So the next, our next discussion, and probably which will mark the end of our lesson today, we shall be looking at the organization of the long distance trade. So when talking about organization, we are referring to how the trade was carried out, who were involved, what were the commodities, how did they do it, and all that. So we'll discuss the organization of the long distance trade. So the first one, the Arabs in Swahili merchants here we're referring to the traders, those are key traders, obtained goods from Banyans, all right? So the Banyans in this case are referred to as actually the Indian Banyans. So the Arabs in Swahili merchants obtained goods from Banyans. Number two, the organized caravans. Okay, so caravans are like where they could carry their trade goods, whereby we had animals pulling those caravans. So the caravans were organized by 2 camels, maybe animals, and then human beings in a clique of number or a clique of people. So they organized themselves, the caravans, expeditions in the interior of about 100 men or more. So we could have a group of 100 men or more walking together. That referred to as a caravan. Then The trade goods were mainly carried by porters. We said porters. These are people whose main role was to carry the trade goods. All right, so they refer to as porters. So the trade goods were mainly carried by porters who carried those goods from the interior to the center probably, and then eventually by the caravans to the coast. Number 4, we say that they traveled inland along the various established routes, which we saw earlier, which had their terminus at Mombasa, Bagamoyo, and Kilwa. So you look at these 3 towns. These are towns along the East African coast. So in other words, this was a terminus, okay? This was a terminus, and this was also another terminus. So meaning they began from that terminal. Beginning from Mombasa, there's a port there. Bagamoyo, there's a port. In Kilwa, there's a port. So they began from there, and then eventually they returned there, okay? And then number 5, trade participants and middlemen. In other words, those who participated in trade and the middlemen included the following people. So sometimes you can be questioned. Identify the communities that participated in long distance trade. So be careful and know them today. So we have the Akamba, okay? Those are from the interior. We have the Mijikenda, of course, some from the coast and some from the interior. We have the Arabs, the Waswahili, the Yao, Nyamwezi, and Khatumas. Those are from Khartoum. So those are the communities that were involved in long distance trade. I repeat, trade participants and middlemen included, number 1, the Akamba, the Mijikenda, the Arabs, Waswahili, the Yao, the Nyamwezi, and the Khartoumas. Okay? So those are, we say Khartoumas from Khartoum in Sudan, southern Sudan. So these are the communities which were involved as middlemen and of course as participants, as traders in that given trade known as the long distance trade. Another point I want us to know that various market centers were set up along the trade routes. That means if it's Ukambani, there was a market trade center in Ukambani. If it meant it was Galana or it was in Taita Taveta, there was a market center just right there to ensure that commodities are got to that center. And then another important point, items were traded using barter system, and later on currency was introduced. Okay? That's another organization that the method which was first used was barter, meaning they were exchanging goods for goods, and then eventually introduction of currency, and like we said, the first currency was cowrie shells, and then eventually introduction of coins. And then in items of trade such as ivory, slaves, rhinoceros, horns, and gum were exchanged for utensils, beads, cowrie shells, and cotton cloth. I want you to realize what we mean here. We have these trade commodities here. These were got from the interior. These were brought to the interior, okay? So this means these are goods like ivory, slaves, rhinoceros, horns, and gum. These were locally got from the local people from the interior. And then to the interior people, we had goods which were brought like utensils, beads, cowrie shells, and cotton cloth. Those were brought to the interior. And then the traders were protected. It's very important for you to note also that there is the aspect of political stability. So the traders, for them to carry out their trading activities, there must be security. So how was that security provided? The traders were protected by the Sultan of Zanzibar and leaders in their territory as they passed through various territories. So you realize also that security was an important aspect, and that aspect of the security was assured by the traders being protected, number 1, by the Sultan of Zanzibar, and then of course by the local leaders that through which the traders were passing. Of course, they had to pay tribute. So even as they passed through that land, they could not just pass. They had to give the king or whoever was the leader some money for him to allow them, or actually give him some presents for them to allow him pass through the land. And then another aspect on the organization, after acquiring the commodities, the caravans will then journey back to the coast and deliver their goods. So meaning that after they have got the goods, they'll journey back and then deliver the goods to the destination. So if it were the Arabs who wanted the goods, they'll take the goods to the Arabs in the coast. All right? So that is very important for us actually to note. All right, having looked at that, I want us to look as we sum up our lesson today, the consequences of long-distance trade. Talking about consequences, we are referring to the results, the outcome, okay, of the long-distance trade. And today we'll discuss these three. In our next discussion, we'll be able to explore more and look at those consequences or results. So the first one is growth of towns, and of course growth of towns included Mombasa, Lamu, Pemba, Zanzibar, and Kilwa. These towns were the trading centers, the center in which trading was done. So they grew. Number two, there was increased volume of local and regional trade in the East African interior. In other words, the way trade was carried out initially was less. But now with more people going to the interior, there was increased volume of local and regional trade. Lastly, but not least, there was also the aspect of introduction of new crops to East Africa. For example, crops like rice, banana, sugarcane, and mangoes. So ladies and gentlemen, those are some of the consequences, but we shall be able to explore more of the consequences in our next discussion. So therefore, that marks the end of our discussion today. Take care of yourself and see you in our next lesson. Goodbye.